Well, Luke, how are you doing this afternoon?
Hey, I'm doing really well, Will. How about you?
Good, doing good, doing good. I want to thank you for taking the time to come on the show today. And to get us started, do you mind giving us a brief bio and some of the big ideas you're interested in?
Sure. Brief bio. Born and raised in Michigan, went to Stern undergrad, worked on Wall Street for a little bit, worked in private equity and left in my early 20s, moved to California and ended up founding four companies in my 20s. A couple successes, a huge failure, and then I walked away from one out of sheer boredom, pretty much. And then in my late 20s, I had I call it a quarter life crisis. Hopefully, it wasn't a midlife crisis. Hope it was a quarter life crisis. And took some time away, and realized I had this deep desire to immerse myself in philosophy and classics. I sort of, I guess, I yearned for the classical education I never had, and I had the luxury of being able to give it to myself, essentially, and sort of self-taught myself a lot of this stuff. And what I thought would be a 6 or 12 month time to do that, traveling around the world, reading everything that I wanted to read, ended up turning into more of a 5 year journey. I moved to Italy for a few years. I seriously discerned religious vocation at one point. Spent some time, in and out of some monasteries and retreats, and I was an odd duck in that situation. Given background in finance and especially in the startup world, that's not common. So that's, and then I eventually sort of came back to the States and re-immersed myself in a lot of the same stuff I was doing before, in the startup world and in business investing, but with trying to bring a different framework to it and a different perspective, and a better appreciation for what it was I was really trying to do and what was important to me, which is really to try to build a healthy human ecology. So big ideas. I've wrestled with God my whole life, so that's a big idea. I ended up getting a degree in theology during that 5 year period. Obviously, Rene Girard, has been highly influential to me. I wrote a book on his core ideas to try to make them a bit more accessible to the broader public. Work has been a big idea of mine. I've been thinking about it a lot these days, especially given the so-called Great Resignation. I've been thinking about the reasons why people work, a spirituality of work, how people find meaning in their work. That question's been really important to me pretty much my whole life. And broader questions of sort of the intersection of I would say technology, religion, and philosophy. So, big fan of a book and interested in a book and ideas by a guy named Michael Novak, who wrote a great book called The Spirit of Democratic Capitalism, where kind of all these things kind of come together in the same book, where you're sort of grappling with these questions, like, what does capitalism look like in the world that we live in today? What does it mean to be spiritual in the way that we, in the world that we live in today? So I kind of, my meme for those three things is Athens, Jerusalem, and Silicon Valley, right? Like, what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem, have to do with Silicon Valley? That goes all the way back to the, second century question that Tertullian asked. We said, what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? And he was saying, what does faith have to do with reason, essentially? What do these two things have to do with each other? And he was basically saying that, Christians shouldn't be looking to rationalism and philosophy, right? We're in Jerusalem. And I think today we have to add a third city to that mix, call it Silicon Valley. It's not a city, or call it San Francisco, whatever you want, that stands in for me or represents technology, capitalism. So, how do these three things come together? I call it the three city problem, kind of riffing off the three body problem, right? Where it's like, that you can't calculate where these things are going to end up in space, right? It's impossible to do that. So the way that these three things are interacting in very interesting ways right now is something that also fascinates me a lot.
Definitely, definitely. I love that. And these things are all so connected, right? I remember I was listening to a lecture by Girard over the weekend, kind of prepping for this podcast. One of the things he said was, a lot of times we think we stopped burning witches because, we started becoming rational. But he's like, maybe we became rational because we stopped burning witches. So all these things, they come together in very interesting ways.
We're still burning witches though, unfortunately.
Right. We still are, but
Yep.
Perhaps in some ways it works just a little bit less well than it did in the past.
Exactly.
I'm curious, I hear your story. I really enjoyed the book, by the way. It was excellent. And we'll plug it at the end of the podcast and make sure people have show notes so they know where to go and find it. But one of the things I found with a lot of people that have come to Christianity on the podcast, especially tech people, usually, there's this process where they go through, maybe their lives are really hectic. They're chasing like a lot of goals, which maybe they're of this world and they're not particularly pure, or chasing their desires, I should say. And then they reach this breaking point, and then this has them question everything in their lives, and they go out and in some ways they find God and they find their way back out of the desert, if that makes sense. Was this kind of the case for you? If you had to chart your own journey, like things just got more chaotic. You were chasing things like you didn't really know why you're chasing them, and then one day things kind of break and you have to reevaluate.
I wouldn't quite describe it as things got super chaotic, actually. I mean, I was in, I would say, because chaos and disorder is a big theme. And I think it's a really important theme. Actually, I think chaos and disorder, Jordan Peterson talks about it a lot, but it's actually like at the core of everything that Rene Girard writes about too, right? The scapegoat mechanism as a mechanism of order. Right. And disorder, both. We can talk about that later. But so I wasn't in a particularly large amount of disorder at the time in my life where I chose to explore this deeper. I was raised Catholic, sort of cradle Catholic. And I think that I think people can have conversions in a lot of different ways. As many ways as there are people, right? A lot of people that read Girard end up sort of coming to an understanding of Christianity in a highly intellectual way. And I would argue sometimes almost an overly intellectual way. And I've been, trying to do that. I think Peter Thiel is the way he describes kind of what Girard did for him, is it sort of made everything at least click intellectually. But for me, that wasn't really enough. And I think that I had an experience of, I guess, my own weaknesses and shortcomings. And that became really apparent to me at a certain point, call it, my own sinfulness. And that was really that combined, right, with, I think, the intellectual formation that I had received, not only from Girard, from many other thinkers in the classical tradition for me. I think those things combined really are what sort of like led me to the brink, allowed me to let go of my own will a little bit. And, it didn't happen overnight. I don't sort of have this kind of like moment. It was just this kind of long, like slow burn. A lot of it, me like letting go of kind of, you call it a will to power or something like that, right? That I had to control everything in my life. And in letting go of that, I sort of described this in the first part of my book with, when the Zappos deal fell apart. There was a bit of letting go that I experienced as tremendous freedom, which was a paradoxical sensation, sort of a paradoxical thing for me to feel, that the very thing that I thought I needed to be free was the very thing that was sort of, keeping me imprisoned inside of myself.
Definitely. It makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense. I'm curious. I want to talk about desire. And this plays into, kind of like the Zappos deal and how we got here, how you got here. How do we come to desire anything in the first place? And why is that important?
I certainly follow Girard's ideas on this. I haven't found any. I think when you combine Girard with sort of especially a classic, for me, a Thomistic understanding of desire and teleology, right? That, desire, we desire, ultimately it's a signpost leading us towards something. And the big question is, what is that thing? And a theist is going to have a different answer than somebody who's not. But Girard's, I think, and for the theist, God is the originator of all desire, and it leads back to him. But Girard's sort of understanding of the genesis of desire being in and through human relationships was a game changer for me. It really exploded my very modern individualist idea of myself. And I realized that, I'm constituted by the relationships in my life. And I think that we all are, beginning with my parents. And, I was leaning into what Girard calls the romantic lie of my own autonomy, the romantic lie that there's a straight line between me and the things that I want. And as I looked back at my life, from the very beginning, I could sort of see some of the very strong models that had led me in different directions, including why I wanted to go to the college I wanted to go to, why I wanted to work on Wall Street, even though I hated the kinds of work I always did. Even I should have known better. I should have known when I was an undergrad that working on spreadsheets was going to make me miserable. So we come to desire the things we desire, not entirely, in my opinion, and this is a point of debate among people that read and follow Girard. I wouldn't say entirely through mimesis. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me, right? Because there are plenty of things that I desire through, multifactorial. I walk in a room, there's all kinds of reasons why I could be attracted alone. There's all kinds of reasons why I could be attracted to a certain piece of food at the buffet and not another one. A certain person. And, that can have something to do with biology, something to do with psychology. But I think that at a certain point, there's always a little mimesis involved, and it sort of falls on a spectrum. Mimesis meaning that we're affected by what other people want. They model desires to us, and we adopt those desires as our own without usually knowing that we're doing it. And that is, I think, really important to understand, that it operates on a kind of a continuum or a spectrum. And lately, I like to use the example of, Bitcoin. You can have two people that buy the same amount of Bitcoin on the same day, and one of them could do it for far more mimetic reasons than the other one, if that makes sense. One of them could have done research and have really rational explanations for it. There might be a little mimesis. How would they known to have looked into Bitcoin in the first place, right? If there wasn't some of that going on. But far less mimesis than somebody who does it as sort of a knee-jerk, reaction, where FOMO is kind of the dominating force in the decision-making process and the desire. So I think that's, we can sort of look at a lot of things in our life along this kind of spectrum, and then we can ask ourselves seriously, like, how mimetic am I actually being? So it's really a good examination of conscience for me, because sometimes when I'm honest with myself, I see that I on the surface, I can give you these, like, what I think are really smart reasons why I do pretty much everything that I do, right? We always think that, but being honest with myself, I realized that there's a lot of mimesis driving a lot of the things that I want.
Got it. So it's something like we should spend more time thinking about why we want certain things, and understand that, copying drives a lot of it, and copying, kind of our models, people we look up to. And we should probably, spend more time thinking about that. I'm curious, how do you think about differentiating between, desires that are more pure versus desires that are driven by, this mimetic kind of energy, this force? Is it just like sitting down and thinking, like, okay, like, why am I desiring this thing? Is it just that process of just sitting there and taking a moment to think about it? Or is there some other criteria you use to think about what desires are kind of more pure and good versus things that are kind of bad, if that makes sense?
Yeah, you use the word pure, which immediately calls to mind, one of the Beatitudes, right? Like, blessed are the pure in heart, they will see God, straight from the Sermon on the Mount. So what does pure of heart mean? I sort of interpret that to mean a purity of desire. And, it's hard for me to answer the question without sort of bringing my own tradition into it. What makes a desire more pure or less pure? Certainly, sin has something to do with that, right? From a Christian standpoint, the classic vices, the classic sins. So, that's certainly one factor. So I think, that's something that I sort of examine. I mean, envy being the one that Girard said was kind of the predominant form of mimetic desire in our world today. And it's the one that people like to talk about the least, like far less than lust, right? I mean, people openly brag about their lust. Well, at least a lot of young men that I know
Right.
will openly brag about it, but envy, not so much, So I think that from a Christian framework, I think the answer is pretty clear, right? I mean, there's certain sort of biblical guideposts there to sort of evaluate, right, the things that we want, right, and have an understanding of purity. Let me just put that aside though for a second, because I could talk about that all day. Just on a basic level, I think a lot of times we're talking about mimetic desire or just desires in general, and it can become very abstract, and that doesn't seem very, like, the desire doesn't seem like it's grounded in much of anything at all. And I think, so what does it mean to sort of, be a little bit more grounded in desire? Well, just in the last few months, having dealt with some really difficult family situations, my mom was in the hospital. I took over as the primary caregiver for my dad. And suddenly, I mean, really in the course of 24 hours, like, I didn't have the luxury of being able to like think about like, well, where do I want to go on vacation?
Right.
What do I want to, I don't know. What do I want to write next? What do I, like all of these kind of like abstract things that I am able to do, were just gone. And I was sort of grounded in this real, like, concrete reality of the responsibilities that were in front of me, sick parents, a house that I had to clean and get on the market, and family responsibilities, people that have children, right? I sometimes think like, people that have a lot of family responsibilities and just do hard work and have to roll up their sleeves. Like all this talk about like mimetic desire, it can just be like, well, what are you talking about? Like, I have to like wipe my baby's ass and I have to, do X, Y. And so I think that there's a certain like groundedness, right? Those things are by nature, they're not as mimetic. Because they're just like real incarnate realities, responsibilities that we have to do. And I think that that can be a tremendous gift when we're faced with that. And I think maybe that idea is maybe secretly behind the desire that a lot of people have to, go move on farms and stuff like that. I mean, they always find out that it's not as glamorous as it looks in the documentaries, right? But I do think that there's some tacit understanding that there's something really like beautiful when we're grounded in the real.
Definitely. And it almost seems like it's fairly easy to spot it in other people. It seems like to me, it's some level at least, right? Like I remember in college, all these people are like, oh my God, like, I really want to go work at Goldman Sachs. And I'm like, man, that sounds like really boring, like, and terrible, you know what I mean? And, but when you're caught up in it, it's like it seems so vivid and real to some extent and very difficult to escape.
Absolutely. I mean, I when I stumbled on Girard's thought, I saw it in everybody but myself. And I joked with some of my friends too. When I sort of was in that process of discernment, it was super weird, man. Because I moved to Rome and I ended up living. I mean, at 29 years old, I ended up living with like 100 other guys with a shared bathroom after I'd made a lot of money in my 20s, and lived a pretty comfortable life. And so it was a jarring experience, right? It was very humbling. And, you get there and you're like, well, these are all guys that are like seriously just discerning, religious life. And the first thing you say to yourself, or the first thing that I said to myself is, shit, these guys aren't that holy. And then about a week later, I said, shit, I'm not. and you sort of see all of like the petty little, and you'll be living in sort of a sterile, closed environment like that. It's, what I call in the book, like a freshmanistan. It's like, basically like being a freshman in high school all over again, but even worse because everybody's 29 and everybody has a big ego and people are like paying attention to how much spaghetti the other guy's putting on his plate because he took more. So it's just can be really crazy. And then you realize that you start doing that stuff too. And it takes a certain amount of awareness or a good mentor, somebody to be honest with you and tell you when you're doing that. yeah, that's really the challenge with this, is, it's easy to spot it in the economy, I think, in the stock market. But the more personal it is, the harder it's always going to be.
Definitely. We had Jerry Bowyer on the show a while back, and one of the things he mentioned is a kind of an antidote to these things is to, instead of looking around, it's kind of to look up to and try and emulate Jesus. The question I didn't ask him then, which I'll ask you now, is what does that mean in practice? Does that make sense? What attributes of Jesus should we seek to emulate, if that's even a useful model?
Well, I certainly think Jesus is a useful model, certainly, at least for a Christian. And even in his humanity, I think he's a useful model for anybody. Sort of what it's funny. So people ask me all the time, so like, what model should we adopt? And I think, look for models of humanity, people that model a different way of being human, right? A different humanity. And I think even when one sort of strips the claims of divinity aside, I think that, like, what's the most attractive way to be human, right? And I think that actually is what led me down the path of exploring Christianity more closely in my adult life, because I was like, well, that sort of seems like the kind of man that I want to be, before I had really got into the theological questions. So the humanity of Christ, I think, is worth meditating on and reflecting on. And when you see, Gandhi sort of famously said, maybe I'd be a Christian if I'd ever met one. When you see any semblance of that in the real world, it's incredibly attractive. Just on a human level, and it's sort of a chord that sort of pulls one to explore a little bit deeper. It can be abstract though, and so for me, I'll just personally, for me, being a Catholic, it's grounding myself in like the life of the church, right? So which is sort of the body of Christ. So it's inserting myself into liturgy and worship and a rhythm of life and a plan of life. That's how it's concrete for me, and without that, and it's also like sort of it's in a way, it's the best way for me to say this. There's inserting myself into a tradition and sort of submitting myself to it has its own, taking on that yoke sort of is a way of following Christ. The way that I think, like, having children like changes a man, for instance, right? Like it just happens, like it's just going to happen. Without you even having to spend a whole lot of time thinking about it, right? Like just by the sheer necessity of having to do certain things and take on certain responsibilities. And for me, that sort of like liturgical life, like the life that I've constructed for myself as a member of a community, has done that for me, and has made it concretized and incarnate for me. So, that there's probably a lot more to say there about just like the importance of being a part of a community in general, aside from an ecclesial community. And I think that's kind of where a lot of growth happens. And, that can happen. It could be in a company, it could be in a family, sort of at the more intimate that community, the better. And of course, the church, if it's actually functioning correctly, is meant to be a very intimate community.
Is it something like a reminder that maybe you're not the most important thing going on all the time? Like your individual self is not, there's more important things, the world that you should be paying attention to.
Yeah. It's funny you say that. So I'm a big fan of retreats, and specifically silent retreats. And I've been working on organizing some of these for super busy, super successful people, entrepreneurs, because I've just seen like there's a huge demand and a huge hunger for it. And, I get and I did one of these not too long ago, and from a few people who I know well enough to be able to give them a hard time, it's like, well, I'm so busy, there's no way that I could ever leave my company for 3 days to go on one of these things. Like the whole thing would just fall apart in a matter of 3 days if I was to step away and not be on my phone. And I'm like, dude, you're not that important. Like you're important, but I promise you that you stepping away for 3 days is not going to make or break this company, because people are going to be able to step up and you're just not as important as you think you are.
Right. Exactly.
So like, I know him well enough to be able to give him a hard time about that. But I mean, there's always an excuse. So the short answer is yes. I think that's a big part of it, right? Like understanding that we're part of something bigger here. All of us are part of a tradition, whatever it is. We've been shaped by it probably far more than we know. And, for me, it was sort of a matter of like rejecting it as hard as I could, and then realizing that it had sort of, really shaped me as a person, and then inserting myself back into it later in life.
Definitely.
I'm very McIntyreing, I guess, and sort of some of this stuff.
That's good. I want to talk about envy a little bit more. I was struck by the thought a couple of days ago that, social media platforms, things like Instagram in particular, the study I read, Jonathan Haidt either put out or retweeted, and it was something along the lines of, if you look at the rise of teen suicides, it corresponds with the rise of social media, particularly Instagram. It's like photo-based medium where you only show the best parts of your life that ever happened. And it's like, just, hyper mimetic and just straight into your veins. Do you think this is like something where it's often missed in the debates about social media, is like this hyper mimetic kind of attitude and like the envy that comes out of these platforms, because it is just so taboo to talk about envy?
Yes. Yeah. And I think the work that some people are doing in the space, John talks about it, Tristan Harris talks about it. The focus is really on the tech itself and on the dopamine hits of the tech. So it's a pretty materialist kind of, way to look at it.
Right.
And I think all that stuff is true. I think it's all true. I just don't think that it tells the whole story. It's the irony is that we create the technology, which means that it's derivative of us. It's subordinate to us. And then we end up imitating the technology, that we created. And there's a beautiful psalm that kind of talks about, the imitation of people imitating the works of their hands, and how perilous that is. Those are pretty low models to imitate. And, I wasn't a General Jim Mattis said something like, PowerPoint's making us all stupid or something like that. And it's sort of like outlawed in the Pentagon. It's just an example of technology. Like we conform ourselves to the very tech that we built. I think porn has had detrimental neurological effects on us. We have a whole generation that's been raised with us. There's been trickle up porn aesthetics that have made their way into people's bedrooms, and we don't even understand how much this is affecting us. But envy is something that nobody really talks about. Didn't Instagram, they launched their own internal study. Didn't this come out a few months ago? And they found that something like, 1 in 3 teenage girls has really bad, sort of body image issues because of Instagram. Instagram's internal research identified this, and they didn't want it to get out. Similar study, and there's an island in, I think it's around Fiji. There was an island where there was not a single television on the whole island. They were introduced, I think it was in the 70s. And within a year of television being introduced on that island, a massive proportion of young people, particularly young girls, had body image issues. And I remember very distinctly that the crazy thing was that in that culture, being skinny was not attractive. It was actually the opposite. Being too skinny was not a sign of health. And within a year of having television introduced in that island in the 70s, it totally reversed, because they were being exposed to images from the West, of extremely skinny people. And I think that was back in the 70s, and it was with television. And I think Instagram is just the same study on steroids. So, envy is part of that. geez, when we cite these studies, I don't know why they all talk about teenage girls, because guys are
Right.
as bad, if not worse. That's telling in and of itself that we're not examining this enough, right? But certainly, like, one thing I've noticed just over the last few years is, the propensity of men to brag about both their gains and their losses in the stock market, right? It's like, especially on Reddit. And we're all paying attention, at least if you're on those platforms. Like, you can't help but not pay attention and measure yourself in some way. And I think that it ends up becoming the real power of social media. I think that I lived in Vegas. I understand the effects that a slot machine has on the human brain, but these are all extremely sort of materialist views to me. And the effect that it sort of because I do think of Girard and a lot of the things he's writing about desire as being somewhat spiritual, desire being for me in sort of a spiritual plane. And I think that is far more powerful to think about, that draw, that temptation to constantly compare out of envy and out of pride is the real engine. I think I wrote in the book that it's the engine of social media, far more than anything that Dopamine Labs, real company, could ever come up with to engineer their apps to be more addictive.
Definitely. The spiritual plane does seem to be at some level much more important, at the very least. I'm curious. It seems like we live in an age where, at some level, the individual is being, smashed. It's like everything's collective. Like, even in IdPol, identity politics, I think about it. It's like we're essentially defined by categories. Like, where do you sit in any given category? Things like this. I'm curious. How important is emphasizing the uniqueness of each individual? I think that's an important lesson I get from Christianity, is how everyone is unique, everyone is important, but it's something that seems to be somewhat missed, and the individual has been somewhat smashed within the modern discourse.
Yeah, I think it's even been, missing within Christianity, for the most part, within the church. I see it myself. So, John Paul II, I think he was writing way back in the 60s, during the Cold War, wrote, and this has really jumped out at me, this quote, I'll never forget it. He said, "The evil of our times consists in a pulverization of the fundamental uniqueness of each person. That evil is even more on the metaphysical order than the moral order." So, sort of a metaphysical degradation, a metaphysical pulverization of the fundamental uniqueness of the human person. So, he's a Christian personalist. The Pope was not this like hyper individualist. That's not what he's saying. But communism was very much on his mind, and sort of this collectivist sort of trend, and I see it again in the world. He's warning about that on the metaphysical order. Now, he was writing really before the internet, as we know it, and that line is so haunting to me, because I'm now thinking about what something like digital identity does to adopt his word, right? To pulverize our unique metaphysical sort of identity, to homogenize us into bits and bytes, or NFTs on a blockchain, or whatever. So there's kind of a mass homogenization going on that I think we have to fight against. So I'm not a techno utopian, and one of the main reasons that I'm not, even though I think some people that have some really smart ideas, I haven't heard a convincing case for it not continuing to pulverize the fundamental uniqueness and unrepeatability of each human person at the metaphysical level. And I think that's really important to put the brakes on, or to think seriously about how technology is shaping that. Because Girard himself said that when there's this mass homogenization, and when there's kind of a too much similarity in the metaphysical order between people, then you have a crisis of undifferentiation, crisis of similarity, really, that ends up, making people fight to differentiate themselves in increasingly crazy ways. And people end up, sort of, you get into Lilliputian fights about the correct way to slice an egg, eventually. So, it is concerning. I think it's actually the number one thing that anybody in tech needs to think about. What do we do about that? What can we do? Well, I think, attending to the uniqueness of each person is really important. Getting to know people on an individual level, breaking through the mediated reality that is social media. I think we forget how weird it is. I don't know if you've ever met anybody that's been like a mutual friend of yours on social media. Like, have you ever met anybody for the first time in real life? It's weird, man. It's really weird. And then, you forget the reality of the person, and the uniqueness, and you're sitting down to talk to them, you're getting a beer and you're like, their voice sounds different. Or they, you even pick up little traits and characteristics that were flattened, suppressed, whether intentionally or unintentionally, in the digital world. And there's kind of this like awesome like breakthrough of this metaphysical reality that we so often forget. And I think that we have to be intentional about making that happen, because the world doesn't seem to be doing it for us. Like, it seems like this is an area where it's most important to be anti-mimetic and to not just go with the flow, because the flow seems to be, floating downstream seems to be towards less and less of our fundamental uniqueness.
Definitely. Well, and it seems like even at the level of, people are incredibly lonely today. People they're not involved in social groups like they were, like the PTA and, all kinds of different things, let alone church attendance. I mean, church attendance is just like, it's flatlined, right? Do you see that kind of trend reversing? I mean, like, especially like in your case, like, are you bullish on church attendance going back up if people like more in-person community once we get through the pandemic, or is this just like a continuing trend where we're more connected at one level than we ever have been before, but at the basic human level, we're less connected than we ever really have been?
I'm certainly not bullish on church attendance. I sort of follow, the former Pope Benedict, who basically said, it seems like we're headed towards being an inevitably smaller church, but hopefully stronger church. I do notice it's funny, and where I go, like in some of the more traditional communities, they seem to be bursting at the seams with attendance, and a lot of young people, and some of the other places where you have some kind of I don't know, I call it more like sort of modernist sort of like liturgies are empty, and the emptying out is not enough to compensate for what I see flowing over to some of the other communities. So I think it's going to continue to decrease, and I'm just speaking within the Catholic world. I think mainline Protestant churches are in serious trouble. So I think people are finding substitutes for that. I think they're finding them in everything from crypto to Discord servers to the workplace, and I think that there are a lot of substitutes now for that. So human connection, and the broader point is human connection in general, and I think it's really, really important to not allow the digital connections to be a substitute for the in-person connections. Can they scale? Not really. But
right.
I don't know. I feel like scale has sort of become a bit of a god. Scale at all costs, and if you can't scale it, it's not worth anything. Man, there's a great book. I should look it up real quick. There's a great book that just came out, all about scale, and I'm only 5 pages into it, which is why I can't remember the name of it. But I highly recommend it, because it sort of takes this very nuanced view of the way that we think about scaling things, which everybody in my world and yours probably, looks at leverage, scale. These are all wonderful things, but it acknowledges where they're important. And then it acknowledges like where we don't need to scale, where we shouldn't scale, where scale is actually detrimental to human life.
Definitely. And I mean, it's so interesting, right? I mean, even in our public spaces, I mean, no one can really go into public spaces anymore. Like, I think about the areas where I actually interacted with people of all different walks of life. And the last time that happened to me was in high school. I went to a public school in rural Eastern North Carolina. I got to meet everybody. I think about how few people I know even had that experience. And now, we can't even get together in person, period, due to the pandemic. But it just seems like this trend, and offices are going away. It just in-person community just seems to be on the decline, and it seems like a really bad trend, just generally.
I totally agree. And the name of that book, just so I can, I don't like plugging my own book, so now I can actually plug somebody else's because it's really good. It's called The Voltage Effect: How to Make Good Ideas Great and Great Ideas Scale by John List. Phenomenal. I'm only a little bit into it, but it's great.
Awesome. I'll put it in the show notes and be sure to include it. Do you mind if I throw out a quote from Girard and just get your take on it? Is that cool? Sure. Cool. Yeah. So Girard says, having repudiated religion in order to become more rational, modern man comes full circle, and in the name of superior rationality, embraces a rational and technical form of irrationality. What do you think Girard meant by that?
If I remember right, he says that, and I say says that rather than writes that because like the vast majority of his corpus is from dialogues and conversations that he had with other people. That's why Cynthia Haven's book, Conversations with Girard, is so great because it just captures the conversations. But he said that in the context of talking about how the modern world is sort of different than the world, say, pre the French Revolution. And he uses this, he's talking about this phrase, the cult of experts. And he says, now having repudiated religion. So let me translate that. Having repudiated the old models, okay, having, we no longer look to the saints or the priests or anything like this. The old models don't work no more. We don't look to them. We're too rational for that. So having repudiated all of them, and I would say, and throwing the baby out with the bathwater, we've now adopted a new kind of model, and this new kind of model is the hyper rational. It's the expert. And he said, now, we used to have the cult of saints. Now we have the cult of experts. And the problem with that is that it's rationalism untethered or divorced from everything else, from any kind of framework in which rationalism can operate in a healthy way. And rationalism, can become extremely tyrannical. And some of the worst things in human history, they've all been rationalized by the people that did them. Okay, so when he says we've come full circle, we've embraced a rational and technical form of irrationality. He means, among other things, that we're just finding just different ways to enact the scapegoat mechanism, but now. We stand on our rationality when we do it, even though it's a kind of rationality that's divorced from, sometimes from a moral framework, from any kind of transcendent framework, from anything that would put guardrails on it. And, we use it to justify ridiculous things. Look at some of the things that have been done in the name of reason in the course of the pandemic. This hyper-mimetic rush to some decision based on partial reason that doesn't account for all of the circumstances, that doesn't account for the reality, for all of the different complexity that goes into basic decision making, right? Is it rational to not allow somebody to see their dying family member in the hospital who has COVID, right? So these are things that we've been grappling with, and I think that Girard is warning against the new idols is another way to put it. And he calls them experts, and experts have a bad rap. I'm not against experts, but I think what Girard is warning against is having thrown out all of the old models, because we need models,
right?
It's just a matter of where we're going to get them from, and we have to be careful that our new gods are not a lot worse than the old ones.
What you're saying, and I love that explanation. Reminds me of whenever people say, trust science, they never mean trust the process of forming a hypothesis and testing it, et cetera. They always mean trust the experts, which really this just interesting thing. Like, it's this new model we need to copy going forward.
I find that both when people start talking too much about the science or the experts, they're both of those words to me are poker tells, right? For this person is full of shit, or actually doesn't want to have a serious conversation, right? About like testing a hypothesis, right? Because science is actually advanced by people having different opinions, that's the whole point. That's how we move forward. And, when we begin to, when people don't want to see that happen, and then they start talking about the science and trust the experts, it's just a massive red flag.
Definitely. Are you down for a round of overrated, underrated before we let you go?
I'm down. Let's do it.
All right. So the line from Hamlet, Polonius says this: "Be true to oneself." Is that overrated or underrated?
I'm gonna go overrated on that one. It wouldn't be very Girardian of me to not say that. It's overrated, because what does be true to oneself even mean if we're in this dyadic sort of mimetic relationship all the time, right? So, I can't be true to myself unless I'm true to my wife, right? I can't be true to myself unless I'm true to something outside of myself. So I'm gonna say that one is overrated, but certainly is one that I think let's say 90+% of people would probably kind of do it Frank Sinatra, as I did it my way. It kind of fits right into that, but I think it's overrated.
Catholicism, overrated or underrated?
Well, I think you probably guessed what my answer to that one is. I'm going to say underrated. Gotcha. Not.
How about two Protestants? So I'm Protestant. Do Protestants generally underrate Catholicism?
And vice versa, yes. I think that Catholics underrate Protestantism, and I think that that Catholics and Protestants would be very wise to draw on the rich traditions of the other, right? Like reading like Karl Barth been highly influential for me, because I think together we form a bigger picture, right, of what it means to be a Christian. So Catholicism, I think it's hard to call something underrated that I guess has formed such a huge backdrop to the last 2,000 years with the church and the role that it's had to play. But I think that it's underrated because some of the beauty of the tradition has been obscured under some of the sort of tragic scandals that we've seen over the last couple decades, which is sort of call it a stock that is just had a like 10 really, really bad earnings calls in a row. But the fundamentals are still really solid.
Definitely. Gil Bailey's Violence Unveiled, overrated or underrated?
Oh man. I mean, everybody that's read that book loves it, including me. So I would just say it's not underrated by anybody that's read it, but it is massively underrated, or just people aren't aware of it in the Girardian community. It's just a fantastic book. It's really one of the smartest that I've read. I mean, if anybody really wants an intro to Girard, it's one of the first books that I would recommend, actually, aside from Girard's work himself. I pulled the phrase from that book, which makes up a chapter in my book, and it's disruptive empathy. Gil uses that phrase, disruptive empathy, sort of, the kind of empathy that disrupts a violent scapegoating process. Just really struck me. So I borrowed it, acknowledged him, but I borrowed it because I thought it was so powerful. So the book is just full of rich, like saturated phrases like that, and really smart insights. And Gil is just a great guy. Had the privilege to meet him up in Sonoma where he lives, and he's just incredibly great human.
Definitely. Yeah. I found the book. I think it's criminally underrated. I got so much out of that book and just explaining modernity. It's just an incredible book. So I got to plug that. Well, Luke, thank you so much for taking the time to come on. Where should we send people? Where can people find you? Where should they go?
You can go to lukeburgis.com. That's my handle on all social media. And I write a Substack. It used to be called Anti-Mimetic. I just changed the name of it yesterday to The Fourth Wall. So you can find that all on my website.
Nice. And I know you won't do it, but I will. I want to plug the book. It's Wanted. It was incredible. I really enjoyed it. And I recommend everyone go check that out. I'll put a link to it in the show notes.
Overrated at this point, man. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Luke.
Yeah,
I appreciate it.
Take care.